Okay. This is our first Tanner conversation of the year. I'm Scott Black. I'm the director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and I'm delighted to have you here. Today's conversation is between Alice Dailey and Lindsey Drager. Alice Dailey is professor of English and director of faculty affairs at Villanova University. She's author of two superb monographs, The English Martyr, From Reformation to Revolution, and How to Do Things with Dead People, History, Technology, and Temporality from Shakespeare to Warhol. Her work focuses on such ghoulish topics from a broad range of perspectives, considering Shakespeare's history plays, for instance, in relation to technologies like literary doppelgangers, photography, ventriloquist puppetry, X-ray imagery, village art, capital punishment machines, and cloning. She'll be giving a scholarly talk tomorrow in the English department about her hybrid class research project performance of the Spanish tragedy. But today she'll be talking with Lindsey Drager about her new memoir or work of auto theory, which I'm going to ask you to explain, Mother Stories and Elegy, which reflects on her mother's death from the perspective of a daughter, mother, and scholar. Lindsey Drager is assistant professor of English and creative writing. She is here at the University of Utah. She's author of 4 luminous novels, including The Alien Hourglass, which has just been published by Zahn. Her stories have been published in a wide range of journals and magazines, and her work has been recognized with a wide range of awards, including an NEA Fellowship and the prestigious Bard Fiction Prize. She's also a superb teacher and this year's recipient of the college's Ramona Award for excellence in teaching the humanities. So, Lindsey, Alice, welcome.
I have a truly extraordinary PowerPoint that you will not be seeing. I spent an enormous amount of time translating Alice's stunning book into this extraordinary PowerPoint that was going to beautifully accompany the set of questions that I had for you today. Unfortunately, that is just not going to happen. So we're going to go analog. I have gobs of questions, lots and lots to discuss about this extraordinary book. And maybe at some point I can send you this PowerPoint such that you can admire and really truly appreciate the visual nature. So much of this book is ensconced in sort of imagery, manipulation of imagery, and it is really a fundamental portion of a fundamental component to how to understand the book. So you'll have to imagine that today or find a copy. We might be able to, we could pass this, if anyone has a copy of the book just to pass around so that you can get some sense of the visual element. It's really, really fundamental to how the book operates. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of a summary of the book, and then we'll kind of elegantly move into questions. I'm curious, after I'm wrapping up my questions, I'm curious if you all have thoughts or feedback that you would like to introduce as well. I'm more than happy to hear your questions. So, Mother Stories, as the subtitle tells us, is something of an elegy for a complicated woman who happens to be the narrator's mother. It is about that mother's life and about the narrator, Alice, her grief in both coping with the mother's death and coming to terms with the mother's ghost, which is rendered to us through memories Alice relays of their complicated mother-daughter dynamic. But more than that, the book is a deeply affective, emotionally resonant investigation of the power of seeing the world askew through an oblique angle, refracted, so that the binary between reality and artifice is obscured. We see that act of refracting reality over and over throughout the book, threaded between and within vignettes and images. Duplications and copies, facsimiles and replicas, reproduction and twinning, cloning, and genetics all become staple motifs. Photographs as faded traces of lost moments, events canceled and rescheduled with the same itinerary, as if to pick up the day and drop it into a parallel universe 8 months later. Even Shakespeare's history plays themselves, wherein historical figures are turned into stories that are reproduced on stages across time and space. What, in the faces of all this doubling, the book asks, do we do with death, the ultimate end? What do we do with this in life, but also in literature, where those deaths are ends, but only sort of, since the characters are resurrected each time the play is performed or the book is read? Do they never die, or do they somehow, in some way, die more? These are the questions at the center of this book of creative nonfiction, but they are also central to the narrator's identity as a scholar and a professor as well. In a moment of pedagogical panic, I'm sure we can all relate to, the narrator Alice, who is assigned a poem responding to and therein replicating the 1944 circus fire that killed 167 people, including several children, ask yourselves why she assigns sad stories. What is the point of all this death in literature when we are ensconced in death in life? The narrator Alice imagines she will tell her students how she will justify assigning this text. It's a moment I found particularly profound, not just because it is so familiar, in a time when teachers are consistently being asked to defend what they teach, whether to administrators or to other students, but also because of the crystalline simplicity of the answer Alice gives herself and her class the next day. Quote, if you are asking yourself these questions, I admit that I am asking them too. And the only answer I can give you is that we read tragedy because it cultivates empathy. That consciousness of human suffering makes us more human. We read sad books because sadness is part of being alive. Today we are reading to be alive, end quote. In the wake of her own mother's death, Alice admits to herself afterward, quote, it isn't much, but it's enough to get me through. What is death in literature? And how is it different in life? What is the difference between fictional and fictitious? How is that complicated when one is raised by a woman who manipulates fact and history until it warps beyond recognition, until one's own memories become muddy and slushy, unable to take any kind of concrete shape? How do we narrativize our own lives, and what relationship does that have to, or what influence does that have over us, the people in this room, people who love literature? The mother of stories in the title of this book is not just a reference to Alice's mother and her conflation of fact and fiction. This is where I get into my close reading, so you can disagree with me, Alice. I think there's a reading that the mother of stories is also a gesture toward the impulse to replicate, reproduce, create in the face of certain loss. We must tell history over and over, even if it shape shifts in that process. At the beginning of Mother of Stories, Alice Dailey, the flesh and blood author before us, cites Alice Dailey, the author of The English Martyr from Reformation to Revolution, to remind us that the word martyr is not, which is not etymologically linked, but kind of to me feels linguistically, sonically like a cousin to mother, martyr and mother. That martyr originally meant witness, not necessarily someone who sacrifices to their death for some particular cause. The Alice Dailey before us uses the fictional construction of the narrator Alice Dailey, the narrator of Mother of Stories, to cite the scholar Alice Dailey's critical text. Alice, or Alice's, says, in the afterlives of the martyr, we discover a tension that has always resided in the heart of the form, between historical record and typological resonance, between human suffering and human storytelling. I think there's a reading that the Mother of Stories is also Alice herself. So that's where I'm going to kind of start our conversation for today. And could you just start by talking a little bit about the difference between your scholarly identity and your creative identity, if you think of them as binary, if you think of them as in conversation? Just want you to kind of think through, so much of this feels autocritical, to come back to the term that Scott used, and I want you to kind of think through the creative and critical aspects of your identity.
Sure, thank you, first of all, for that awesome sum up of so many things I'm trying to do in this book. I really appreciate your close reading, right? And I agree.
Thank goodness, okay.
And I love too the way you're thinking about all the Alices, because that's certainly my experience of the selves who circulate in this book. My relationship to it now is an artifact that is in some significant, respect in the past. And my scholarly work, which is ongoing and continues to work with these ideas. So I like that formulation as a sort of bunch of Alices who are speaking through each other. In terms of the question about the relationship between the scholarly and the creative self, those identities for me have become a little more coherent with one another through the course of writing this book, which, as you mentioned, reflects in a number of ways on how my scholarly work is a space in which some of the deeper questions that come out of my background, my family, are being worked out through a disciplinary apparatus that is something I learned through the course of my graduate education, right? And through the course of being a junior faculty member and scholar. So lots of the questions that I'm working with as a scholar of martyr literature come from my family, come from Catholicism, which is part of my background. And so those identities have always been related to one another. But what I learned in graduate school, and talk about some in the book, was that the scholarly space was not one in which the personal parts of that could surface, that I had to find ways to address the questions that come up around that through an apparatus, a lexicon that was fundamentally professional, right, and scholarly. In this book, those things collapse into one another frequently, and I go back into my scholarly work and cut and rearrange and cover up in order to disclose the other story that has always been under there, which is the story of my personal life. Something else was happening simultaneously in reverse, which is that I was writing the How to Do Things with Dead People book while I was working on this, and as my mother was dying. And I began to develop in the Dead People book a wish to include a coda that was autobiographical. And so that book is highly theoretical. It is about literary history and also a range of other artifacts, as Scott mentioned. But it ends with a piece about my son, who had been, through the course of my writing that book, dressing up for Halloween as characters in the book, as Andy Warhol, as Shakespeare, as Bowie. And so I allowed myself, in part because I had done this book, to let those two parts of my brain work together to bring things to conclusion. And so I increasingly see them as inseparable, even as I'm moving into university administration, really. Though they're all sort of working together in a way that I hope will create a humane scholarship and a humane form of leadership and an acceptance of the messiness that is the human person.
Yes, all the administrators I've talked to would, from kind of producing text to then teaching and now being administrators, that say, and this is a direct quote from Scott, that if you would think of it as an intellectual pursuit, it's a very different act. And if you think about it as sort of positions of leadership.
Yeah.
We'll talk a lot about erasure toward the tail end of our discussion, but I'm going to pick up on this marvelous transition you have made to talking about your son. There's a moment sort of at the beginning of the book where you talk about like facade and performance, which is fundamental to, the entire book, both in terms of the plays, but also in terms of your mother or the mother figure. And you talk about this moment where, and I'm going to say Alice's son, just to make a distinction between Alice, the narrator in the book, and the human Alice in front of us, where Alice's son is playing Ziggy Stardust and sort of dressed up as Ziggy Stardust for Halloween. And he just learns that David Bowie has died. And he asks, you know, what does it mean? Does that also mean that Ziggy Stardust is dead as well? And Alice, the narrator and mother, responds that Ziggy Stardust is a character, and a character doesn't die the way a person dies. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, in a book about the death of your mother, you sort of turning her into a character in the book. And this, I think, will come back to Eraser and what you decided to leave out. But could you talk a little bit about just that process of taking this really complex woman and translating her into essentially a character in this text?
Yeah, some of the difficulty of doing that for me is that I don't have creative writing training. And this is my first work of creative writing since my early 20s. So I stopped doing that. So I don't know how to write dialogue. I have no idea. And as I recalled conversations with her, things I wanted to, that felt central to what I was doing here, I struggled a lot with how to represent her and the tension between representing her always as a figment of my memory and trying to represent her voice. And it was very difficult. So there were a few key conversations that I recalled as clearly as I imagine I recall them, you know, and could hear her in my mind and produce her in some of the ways that a playwright would create dialogue, right, or create direct discourse with a character. But in many other places, I am narrating her. And I tried to be extremely conscious of that and resist the moments where it felt like it should break into dialogue, but I would have had to make the dialogue up. I couldn't remember it. And to not turn her, as much as is possible, to not turn her into a fictional character. But of course, even as I talk to, for example, my siblings, they both recognize her in this book and recognize her as my her, right? She can't possibly be also theirs. So I have done something to her here, which is to take possession of her in the way a playwright takes possession of a character and ventriloquizes through that historical person a set of things that person probably never said, right?
Yeah, and I mean, even your retrospective reconstruction is a different Alice than the Alice you represent in the book, who's dealing with and coping with this like extraordinary loss, but also the complex kind of rhetoric around that loss. She still needs to be a professor. She still needs to be presenting on death in her scholarship, as well as dealing with it in a very personal way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really interesting to think about not just that split between the real and the construction or the artificial in terms of the mother character, but also the Alice character.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, to sort of continue with this line of thought, I'm wondering if you could read a little bit from page 100 to 101, and just, I'll talk about why I think this passage is really powerful, but I think this too speaks to the siblings and the ways in which your particular professional identities frame your relationship to not just the mother, but also death. Yeah.
Okay. When my sister Joyce started medical school, she participated in a memorial service that had become a tradition for each year's entering class. Like the students before them, she and her classmates began their medical education by honoring the lives of the people whose cadavers they would spend the term studying. She was very moved by this ceremony. I remember her calling me from her tiny studio apartment in Westwood to tell me how humbling it had been to acknowledge the gift of those lives and those bodies. She would go on to write a beautiful thesis about how physicians cope with patients' deaths. As she progressed through her residency and fellowship, she developed her own ritual for marking the deaths of the patients she lost, one that she continues to observe. She folds an origami crane for each person and then strings the cranes into garlands that hang in her office. My doctoral education did not teach me how to mourn the dead. It taught me to write about them in the present tense as subjects of ever-living texts who breathe again each time we open the book. In my discipline, the dead are never dead. They are literary constructs, characters, not people, even if those characters are drawn from real lives. Thinking about them as people does not help us analyze language, we insist. It doesn't help us understand how stories work, and it is this that we most want to know. What do we do then with the grief we feel for the dead who haunt those stories, for the lives whose deaths make up the books I read to make my living? Where does that grief go? My scholarly book about martyr literature took 10 years to write and publish. That's 10 years of my life spent reading and analyzing hundreds of stories about executions and torture, about human bodies dismantled and destroyed. There is no room for grief in this work. There is no room for grief in the dissertation a graduate student writes for the PhD. There is no room for grief in the scholarly lecture she hones to a knife point for the chance at a tenure-track job. No room in the first book she publishes to earn tenure. No room in the meticulous analytical discipline that these labors cultivate. No room in front of a conference audience of fellow scholars or a classroom audience of 20-year-olds. There is no room. But grief, I learned, accrues anyway, room or no.
Yeah, I just love this passage so, I mean, I love this passage for a number of reasons, but in particular because it points out this kind of lovely irony or paradox at the center of your work, which is, you know, we read to feel, and then the act of turning those close readings in that historical context, that kind of theory, applying theory, does this strangely unaffected work to you. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the experience of, I mean, you allude to it here, but just the experience of doing all of that research that was certainly viscerally, you know, demanding, but then to kind of turn, and I don't want to make a binary between, you know, feeling and thinking, but I'm curious, like, what that experience was like, and if you could just talk a little bit about that maybe in one of your critical books.
Yeah, I think one of the places that grief has gone for me or went for me was into my teaching. And so there were episodes from my research with the Martyr book where I encountered things that that arrested me. And when I teach that material, that's a space where I try to bring that in part because I want students to encounter it as the history of humans, right? And so I don't want to abstract it fully into literary history, but into human history some. So I recall, for example, being at the Folger and reading an early edition of Icon Basilica, which is a tract about the execution of King Charles. And he was beheaded and came to the scaffold and made this attempt to get his hair up into a cap so that his neck would be cleanly exposed and the headsman would have a straight shot. And there was this description of him fumbling with the cap and fumbling with his hair. And, you know, I'm sitting there in the Folger, and the book itself, as we know, those of us who've done archival work, just touching these books is an affective experience. But encountering this account of a person I don't like very much, right? He was kind of a jerk. Didn't deserve to be beheaded necessarily, but not a great guy. It was overwhelming. And I had experiences like this looking at materials written by Henry Garnett, who was executed in relation to the gunpowder plot, had been tortured and found these handwritten notes of his in the British Library, where you can see what torture does to a human hand, and it's overwhelming. So there's none of that shows up in the book. There was no place for it. I didn't know how to talk about it without seeming like a sap. And as a person trying to get tenure, a woman trying to get tenure, attempting to perform the critical stance, right, which is necessarily distant. Despite having done that, a reader of that manuscript at Cambridge called my writing style meretricious. So despite all the sanitization that I attempted to do, somehow I was still coming through as a bleeding heart for these characters, figures. So, but I try to talk about these things when I teach, so that the human part of it and the relationship to text and to these artifacts doesn't entirely get lost, so that there is some space for it. But when I teach it, I don't, like cry. I really try not to do that, even though I cried at the folder,
Yeah.
That's how it affects people. Yeah. To encounter those materials.
No, and I do have a question about teaching that I'll hold off for a minute, but wow, what an amazing, like that is real research, when the research is sort of entering you in this way that can't be replicated without being there with the artifact. It's so moving. There's a set of subplots throughout the book. We talked about like cloning and duplication. There's so much kind of just replica-ness happening. But there's also these kind of subplots of parallels and coincidences. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of like the Almost affair, when Alice meets a man who has a parent who died just around the same time as her parent, or the way Alice keeps imagining these parallel universes where her husband is killed in the branch that falls on the house, or the mother doesn't die of mold spore. The mother dies of kind of environmental reasons, or she doesn't die from this mold that's infecting the house. So I'm wondering if you could read a little bit from read all of page 46. And then I could just pick up on this coincidences or parallels, because I think this is my favorite page of the book. This moment just absolutely ruptures me.
It's so interesting.
I love this.
I had a recurring dream for many years that began after my grandma Latham's death. She died of lung cancer when I was 7, and I was given her bedroom furniture. The queen-sized bed with sliding panel storage cupboards built into the headboard felt luxuriously huge for a child my size. But it smelled like my grandmother's house on Yarmouth Avenue, like schnauzers and cigarettes overlaid with potpourri. The furniture arrived empty, but for the dresser's scented drawer paper and a few stray perfumed soaps, whose smell thickened into a spectral atmosphere that clung to my room. My sisters and I eventually threw out the paper and soaps, but the smell never went away. I would dream that I was floating above this bed, almost attached to the ceiling in one corner of the room, looking down at myself sleeping. Across 2 of the other corners, spanning the room diagonally, was suspended some kind of tendon or muscle, a cord of tissue that slowly, rhythmically contracted and released over the sleeping girl. She did not feel its contractions. It was I who felt them, but I could do nothing but hold my dread in silence and wait for them to subside. Just yesterday, I experienced a brief waking deja vu of this dream, a dream I continue to have even after we moved to the Philippines and left my grandmother's furniture in storage on the other side of the world. Although I still recognize the dream the instant its feeling comes over me, I cannot conjure up its effects at will, even if I can picture the suspended muscle. The dream is not an image. It is a tension, a tinny nerve taut and plucked at the heart of me, close to the bone. It's a rhythm of terror that beats in my jaw.
Oh, I love that. And I think it's such a perfect sort of, it provides a kind of petri dish for the larger concerns of the book, right? There's this doubling of the Alice who's looking down at the Alice in the bed. There's a tendon, which you also describe as a tension. So there's like this really interesting kind of language play happening there. And then there's the waking deja vu of imagining one has lived this, but of course it was a dream. So where does the dream world and the sleep world end? I just found that so moving. And it makes me think this tension makes me think a lot of legacy. And family history and reconstructing family history is fundamental to the book as well. But another way of thinking about legacy is citation, which you talk about quite extensively. And so I'm thinking, about the parts of the book that talk about like you kind of inheriting, or Shakespeare inheriting history to make the history plays, right? And then you inheriting the legacy and those who have come before you, kind of Berkey and Parlor style. You're entering the conversation, so you have this conversation that's already existed before you were born. And I'm thinking about that image of the tether, the tension in this muscle. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you teach the history plays, in that tension or tendon between artifice on the stage and reality. And also maybe just talk a little bit about like legacy for you, the scholars that have been important to you, or how your relationship to the scholars who have come before you in that kind of tension.
Yeah, there was an interesting moment where when I was writing about the history plays and trying to think about whether the inheritance that I had received was fundamentally a patriarchal one or a matriarchal one. And it's both, but it is predominantly matriarchal. There has been, the history plays oddly have been dominated by female scholars, especially in the last 30 years or so. So it was a kind of strange moment of why am I even trying to decide whether this comes from men or comes from women, but it had something to do with sorting out my place in that, and whether I am doing something as a woman or doing something as a person who can't help inherit what men have done. So I have been sort of conscious of intervening and participating in various kinds of critical traditions, and also trying to reinvent them. And so I talked some in the beginning of the History Plays book about seeing my rather bizarre, admittedly, like I describe it as strange intervention in the History Plays as one that's informed fundamentally by a feminist politics of difference, right? So when I teach them, I try to teach mainly what Shakespeare is doing as a dramatist. We talk some about actual history. You have to give them, the quick and dirty version of the war and how we get from point A to point Z. But a lot of what I do is to think about ventriloquizing the dead and what purposes the dead serve, how we can do things with them and through them, how we use them to look at ourselves, to think about ourselves, to imagine the future, and what the politics and ethics of that imagining are. Whether there's something wrong with repurposing dead people in order to tell stories that we want to tell, whether there's something either good or bad about staging a history play that translates it entirely out of its original context and into our own. Are we then colonizing the past in ways that are for our own purposes and benefits? I think the answer is yes, and also that's what we're always doing with the dead. And it's, to me, and this is kind of one of the places I come to in the memoir, fundamentally the difference between the dead and the living, that the dead don't have agency and the living do, and that accepting and embracing the agency of the living is what it means to be alive. And it's a thing that my mother didn't do. Mm-hmm. She was attached to the dead and recirculating the dead in ways that gave her no way out, and so the history plays are both a scripting of the past and a scripting of our relationship to it, but also an opportunity to re-inhabit and remake all the time what has come before us.
Yeah, it's so interesting too, because I'm just remembering she was a teacher.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is just fascinating, this kind of like orbiting without thinking about what we have inherited or what has come before us, this legacy, and the ways that we can make it alive. It's so fascinating the way you're characterizing kind of her treatment, because she too taught.
Yes.
Which is just really fascinating. I feel like this book is full of gaps. There's figurative and literal gaps at work. There are moments that this is getting a little meta. The gap of me not being able to show you some of the images that I would have been able to kind of replicate for you. There are images of kind of family photographs wherein the mother has been sort of erased, and there's all kinds of erasure happening, like the literary art of erasure happening throughout the book as well. And so this is a little bit of a not as critical of a question, but I'm just curious, like we're talking about, any historical figure is a reconstruction. What did you leave out? What did you choose not? I mean, I'm fascinated by this research at the Folger that didn't make it in. Any other anything else that felt either you felt like you had to self-censor, or you felt like you did not want to put on a page for either personal reasons or because the construction would have morphed away from what you wanted?
It's mostly the last bit that, for better or worse, these kinds of things end up with a shape, and then material that seems related or connected doesn't necessarily fit into that shape, and so it gets left out. Scott and I were talking this morning about a sort of sidebar story that I would have loved to include and couldn't find a place for, that has to do with the guy I had the car accident with. So I had this car accident after my mother died with a person who claimed to have lost his father in the same month that my mother died. I think that was probably a lie. I think he made that up. Because in the conversations that we had a sort of brief friendship. He told me several other things about his father that were utterly incoherent with what he had initially told me. So I'm pretty sure his father did not die at that time in the way that he said. But also, he introduced me to Murakami.
Mm-hmm.
He gave me Kafka on the Shore. And I then started reading Murakami. And he had told me a number of stories about his life that I then discovered in the he was plagiarizing Murakami for his autobiography. And there was this weird, speaking of repetition, there was this weird way that I had a literal collision with a pathological liar in the course of writing a book about my mother, who was a pathological compulsive liar. And he was also in this way that the book is very interested in, living out, or at least narrating a version of self that was a hybrid of autobiography and fiction. And so it was just a crazy, confluence of all the things that I was working on in this person. But it didn't make it in because it's kind of a whole thing, right? That I didn't have the space for. Another thing I struggled with was an episode that happened in the hospital during the period. My mother was hospitalized. It seemed like she was going to die. So it was kind of, for me at the time, a deathbed experience, her on her deathbed. She didn't die then. She died a couple weeks later. But she was asleep and dreaming, and sat up in bed and started to talk as though she were in a play. And she said, "I can't go on." And I thought at first she was talking about, her life and dying. And then, she repeated several times, "I can't go on, I can't go on." And then said, "My costume isn't ready." And I let this unfold briefly, and then started to, because she was getting distressed, to reassure her that there was nothing happening. She was fine. She was okay. She was in a hospital. There's no play. And then she quickly gained some kind of consciousness and was embarrassed and said in this kind of nasty voice, I know that. And lay back down and then was out again. And so in the book, I talk about the way she asked me at one point in those couple of days to read to be or not to be to her. So there were these strange kind of, the theater is becoming a bed, the bed is becoming a theater. I don't know if I'm who I am here. Am I Hamlet? Am I the stage manager? But it was a really odd, again, sort of confluence of events that circled around my own intellectual interests and these thematics of repetition and recreation that are so central to all of my work.
Yeah, and coincidence,
Yeah.
parallel, and I'm thinking too, just the ways in which the two anecdotes you just offered so perfectly crystallize the fictional versus fictitious that I was getting at the beginning of kind of trying to introduce this book, where the fictional, and this is not my thought, I'm stealing this from Doric Cohn, who wrote The Distinction of Fiction. Okay, I need to cite myself. But she sort of talks about like the fictional is something we move toward because it reveals some kind of truth, whereas the fictitious is something we like dispel because it feels like it's, you know, a trick to us.
Yeah.
And that, I feel like that kind of oscillation or vacillation between those two spaces is just pervasive in this book. So interesting.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's part of the sort of peacemaking that this project was for me, that I was so adamant in my own psyche all the time in relation to her about what was true and what was false, because she just was she lied all the time about anything and everything. And so the experience of being her daughter was one of saying nothing and also reserving in this way that reminds me of Jesuitical equivocation, which is a research area of mine too. Reserving in my head the real thing, which was, that is complete bullshit. And I know that, and you know that, but we're not saying that. But part of what writing these stories down and realizing that I could never write them accurately, there's no such thing, was a humbling encounter with the impossibility of telling the truth or of discerning what it even is. And the multiplicity of truths that coexist in any relationship, psyche, right, experience, piece of literature. So there is a way that the book seeks, I think, ultimately to undo its own truth claims as a project. And the purpose of that is to honor, for me, what is the lived experience, which is messy, but also to sort of be a better daughter and accept that the hardness with which I held that distinction is not one I can continue to hold in the face of my own storytelling actions, you know.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I have one quick final passage. It's the penultimate page of the book. The last page of the book is an image of your mother. So this is the penultimate, the last page of text, and then we'll open things up for questions. This is 189.
So this is hard for me to read, so if I do so robotically, it's because that's how I'm getting through it. But I do love it. So thanks for inviting me to read it. In the myths of ancient Greece, the shades of the dead had to drink from the river Lethe before crossing into the underworld. The waters of Lethe induced amnesia, allowing the dead to enter the afterlife free of the memory of life on earth. I imagine my mother at the edge of this river. She knows what she is supposed to do. She has read all the books, but she does not take a drink as the other shades do. Instead, she dips in a toe and then a foot, and then she wades into the current and begins to cross. Her feet and legs, her torso and hands and arms and shoulders, her beautiful face, the face of my mother, vanishing forever in the swirling water. On the far bank, something emerges that no human word can name. It is brilliant and fantastical, a form, or perhaps a formlessness, too abstract, too otherworldly for our minds of clay to imagine. It rises from the water and disappears into the future.
And importantly, the font fades at the end of that particular passage. So I'll open things up. I think we have a couple minutes for questions. Questions for Alice about process from students about the critical creative identity, any other sorts of questions we have, I'm sure we can tackle them now.
I wonder if you could say something about Alice's and the book's relation to therapy and the therapeutic. I don't think it's a plot spoiler to say that twice Alice turns down cognitive behavioral therapy. I took that to signify sort of the therapy culture's inability to hold Alice's rage, right, or to be trusted with it. And instead, what the book seems to do is adopt a kind of psychoanalytic mode rather than cognitive behavioral, that is free association, gaps, fragments, dreams, repetitions, uncanniness, things like that. Is there kind of, is Alice a lesson about different ways of thinking about therapy or repair?
For me, the therapeutic aspect of the book was so I had heard for decades that the purpose of creative writing was to get it out there. And I always understood that to mean to share it with other people. And I began this project not to do that, not to share it with other people. I had no intention of sharing it with other people. But the phrase to get it out there started to resonate with me as a way of thinking about it not being here. So in the experience of living a life in relation to a person who fictionalized continuously, I had all these conversations in my head that were correctives to her version of things and stories that I couldn't tell because we were not allowed to tell them. We were not allowed to talk about them. So what was therapeutic was actually getting it out of my head and into something else so it could live or die, whatever, somewhere that wasn't my brain. So it was a sort of filing system, really, of downloading or exorcism of those stories from my mind to a database. And it worked. It was freeing. And not in a way that I could not have anticipated. But when I began it, the intense feeling I felt, and I told this to the weird car accident guy. And so somehow that incident jarred it to the surface, that I felt muted, that I felt like there was something gagging me, that there was something stuck in me and it couldn't get out. And so it was the getting it out. And I didn't need someone to listen to it. I didn't need it to be validated. I just needed it to be out and somewhere else. And it was liberating in ways I could not have anticipated.
First, I wanted to thank you, and I want to also apologize. I didn't have a chance to read the book before attending today's discussion with you. But now I definitely want to delve into it. My question is more of an opportunity for you to maybe reflect with us about something you had said about the relationship of the lack of agency in a way that defines the boundary between the dead and the living, but also in relationship to the word martyr, which you said, it's so true. It's so. When we think of the word martyr in English, we don't immediately think of the concept of witness. Lexically, it's kind of lost, or it's been estranged from that, and we think of kind of its political connotation. Whereas like in languages like Arabic, shahid, the martyr, shahid is immediately on a level of like the root of the word, we think of witness. So what is this thing about witnessing and martyrdom? Because there's an agency in witnessing as well. So there seems to be almost a paradox there as well. What is it that the martyr is witnessing? I always ask myself in this question when I think of the Arabic context, especially in light of how that term gets employed today, almost as a term of respect, like the shaheed or the martyr is someone who died in a certain context as well, one that is almost demanding of respect and recognition and memorializing. So that boundary between witnessing an agency, but also losing agency and being unable to witness.
Yeah, I mean, in the martyr book, I'm very interested in form and the form of martyrology and how a martyr is a product of form. And a death must conform legibly to its precedence in order to produce a martyr. So there is a kind of agency, and there's also a form, it's a repetitious and formally bound set of actions. In this, I start this book with that quotation about the martyr as originally meaning witness and not someone who actually died. Because it somehow, in ways that I can't fully articulate, expresses to me the way that my mother and I are bound together in this text as the witness and the one who dies. And that the word martyr came into my vocabulary through fights that my parents had, in which my father said, "Oh, you're such a martyr." So she was sort of this martyr figure for me, and in a way, then I became too in the writing of the book by becoming the witness path of this double construction, this paradoxical construction. And the witnessing is both bound and formal in the way that I'm suggesting martyrdom is, and also different from dying. And so free in a way that a dead person is not. So yeah, it's a way, that term becomes for me here a way of expressing how she and I are in some ways that I would wish to resist, but am nonetheless fulfilling doubles of one another and two parts of a concept that requires both the body and the voice, both the death and the story.
Thank you. Yeah, the symbioticness, the symbiosis there is really important.
It's so interesting to think of the mother as part of this kind of maternal or matriarchal inheritance that influenced your scholarship in this really fundamental way. It's really interesting. Probably have time for one more question. Catherine?
Yeah, I'm gonna stand away so I can see you. I'm in book sounds enormously rich. I haven't read it yet either. And I feel like you are helping me. My mother's 93. I feel like my little boat is taking me to this place. There's a question about signification. I'm wondering whether this aspect of signification was important in the writing or not at all. And that is that it strikes me, especially because I spend whole stretches of time away from my mother. She's on the East Coast. So every Sunday I talk with her, but it's almost remarkable to me that, I mean, we might as well be dead to each other during the week, right? We have no conversation. There's no signification passing between us. But in thinking about what you're writing about, is there an important difference when the body is no longer alive to emit new strings of signification? So the sort of call and response of signification is what we're losing. And I don't know what that means in a book where the mother has been the pathological liar, whether there's a relief that new strings of signification aren't coming.
Yes.
But right, I'm imagining that the looping quality has to have something to do with the way in which whole strings of signification will live on in our bodies, right? Those sentences will be there, those phrases will be there, they'll admit themselves at certain key moments. So just sort of wondering about the agency of the body to emit signification, but also then the agency of the signification in our bodies that might as well be alive inside us. And whether that was at all relevant to you or at all important. And a whole other question, but I don't think you would have time for, is why we are attached to the sort of signifier of the real. And why will it matter for us that you've called this book memoir? And many of the things will have happened. Yes, you will not remember perfectly or whatever, but our attachment that there's a world in which these things not only could happen, but in some measure did happen. So I'm just wondering about those different zones of signification. And that may not be meaningful at all. But
Yeah,
thank you.
no, I talk some about, in the book, about my mother's body, both her living body and her dead body. And the experience of feeling, so my mother had, beginning in her 30s, rheumatoid arthritis. So she had pain in parts of her body that you can't get into, right, as someone from outside. And then as a woman in her 50s, I began to have that pain. And I had these questions about, is my body becoming her body? But also, is this what her body felt like from the inside? And what does it mean to discover parts of yourself through pain, parts that you don't know exist until they hurt. And I think that that was her experience, was that her body as a thing that hurt was too big. It took up, it swallowed everything for her. And so I think some with that body, and also against it, in ways that have become very, very literal, as the plot of this unfolds for the character of me who's in it. But it's definitely something that I'm not just thinking against, but also living against, and living against the deadness that her body represented to me, the more abundantly of it, even before she died. So there's that piece. There was something else I wanted to say about the bodies. Can you ask me the last bit again, Catherine?
Well, just whether there's anything you want to say about, or that you learned about, what I would clunkily call the sort of signifier of the real. In other words, signifiers, we invest with a feeling or a belief in their reality in a different way than fiction.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna kind of admit this, and I don't know how I feel about it, but there is a way when you narrate so thoroughly or are invested as fully as a writer becomes in the sentences and the rhythms and the stories, that it becomes the primary object. So I have replaced my mother with this book, is I guess how I would put it. And that enables me to feel connected to her, and that to feel that she's part of a voice that's mine. Whereas I feel very alienated from the dead her. But I recognize that there is something of violence and misogyny is one of the words I use in the book, in that replacement. And that I am ventriloquizing, but I am also, in a way, I accuse her of colonizing and taking over her to do something that I needed and wanted to do, to feel alive, so that my aliveness is realized. And I think that's part of what the history plays are about for me, is that we are always doing this. We're always using the dead to feel alive. It's part of the great sort of flow of mortality and natality.
That was an extraordinary conversation. Thank you both.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you all for coming. If you want to hear more from Alice on the more academic side, tomorrow at 3:30 in the English department, Linco 3rd floor. But for now, thank you both very much. I thoroughly enjoyed it.